Okay. Here's what we're going to do on Wednesday. On Wednesday will be a work day, which means you can come to lab, you can work on projects, you can get my feedback, and more importantly, view what other people are doing. Because you still have a little bit of time before your assignments are due, especially your final project. So you can take a look at what they're doing and possibly you can get some ideas. If you see something cool and you want to work it in your own project, ask the person. So I've always said, and I should go and make the change now because I always forget by the time the new semester rolls around, that I wanted to make like a little presentation part of the class, you know. So I don't formally have a presentation, but informally, share, collaborate, take a look at what other people are doing, and show off what you're doing. All right, so today we're going to do some things with JavaScript, and so far our JavaScript has been mainly to change the CSS on a page. We're going to get into, in a couple examples today, how we can change the actual HTML, the content of the page, and not just the presentation. I did post a couple of links to Canvas that I'll point out to you to take a look at. One of them is talking about doing JavaScript validation. And if you look at that, it shows you, it's a W3 Schools example, it shows you one way that you can do validation to make sure that the data is required. One thing to remember is required is a HTML5 property. So that's something you have to be aware of. But this shows you how to do kind of old school JavaScript validation, where you have to put in a number between 1 and 10. If you put that in, it works. If you put in some other number, it doesn't work. So this shows you sort of how we do that. All right. So that's a good example to look at if you want more information about JavaScript. In addition, there's something called Jquery, which is sort of built on top of JavaScript. It's a way, it's a set of libraries that simplifies your use of JavaScript. So there's particularly a tool called Jquery UI, which is really neat, where you can go in and you can create easily things like, for example, tabs on your page. If you want to have a tabbed interface where instead of having multiple pages, you have tabs going across the top of the page and you can switch between them. And I'll tell you, this is the second class in a row that as soon as I started lecturing, someone got up and left. So, I don't know what it is. The pre-show is more interesting than the actual lecture itself, apparently. All right. Again, we're not going to spend much time on this, but you can take a look at it. You can do some really cool things really easily, and that's the idea of Jquery, is it simplifies your use of JavaScript. That being said, I think it's important to know JavaScript yourself and be able to do it yourself to, again, understand it on a nuts and bolts level. Here's a good example. Instead of tabs, you can have an accordion control, which allows you to do that. That's a neat way if you have a lot of content that you want to show on one page without making the page too gigantic. All right, we're going to make a couple of tweaks to this one. And what we're going to do is we're going to put a plus sign here when it can be expanded. And we're going to put a minus sign when it's expanded to show that it can be contracted. Okay? So plus sign and a minus sign. So we're going to do that, and that's going to involve changing the actual HTML, because we're actually going to change the content of a little area of HTML. So let me go back into that, and we'll take a few minutes to look at it. And what what we have on this is we have on the LI, on-click toggle menu. And we have that for all three of the main menu sections. We have that on the LI. And what that tells us is that it calls a function called toggle menu, and it passes an argument that says which menu we've clicked on. Have we clicked on menu 1, submenu 1, or have we clicked on menu item 1, menu item 2, or menu item 3? Because then that will tell us if we want to expand submenu 1, submenu 2, or submenu 3. All right, so we call the function toggle menu, and we pass it an argument. An argument is a value that's going to get plugged into a variable that we're going to use to complete the job, to complete the task. In other words, we want to do something with a menu. What menu do we want to do that to? We're going to do that with submenu 1, if we click on this guy. Submenu 2, if we click on this guy. Finally, submenu 3, if we want to click on this guy. So if we look at this, we have a function that's declared in the script tag that's called toggle menu. The name matches, again, and also it's case sensitive. And it accepts an argument. Whenever we call that, whatever name we put in here, that's going to get plugged into the argument. All right, so how does our code work? We have an if statement, a conditional statement that looks to see if a certain condition is true or not. And it's either true or false. If it's true, we do these statements. And again, there's only one statement here, but there could be several statements here. And if it's false, we do this statement. So we check to test if the thing on the page has an ID that matches the argument, which is submenu 1, submenu 2, or submenu 3, depending on where we clicked. If the style for it, display property, is block, that means it's showing, and we want to hide it. So if that's true, if it's showing now, we want to hide it, so we change the display to none. If it's not block, it means it's not showing, and therefore we want to hide. If it's not block, right, it's not showing, and therefore we want to show it. So I'm going to put comments here, which you can put comments in your code, and it's a good idea, especially if it's not obvious from looking at the code what the instruction does. So I'm going to say see if submenu is showing. Now notice I described it like in practical terms, in just English-like terms. I didn't say test to see if the style properties display is equal to block. Anyone that can read JavaScript can tell that that's what that statement does. But why am I doing that? Well, I'm seeing if it's visible. All right, I'm seeing if it's showing. And if it's showing, hide it. If it's not showing, show it. Okay, so if you notice many of these interfaces, I'm not sure if IIS does it or not, but this does it with the little greater than sign, which indicates that you can expand it. And then it has it pointing down when you can contract it. All right, so when it's pointing like this, like a greater than sign, it means that you can expand it. When it's like a caret, it means that you can hide it. We're going to use a plus and minus instead, because I've also seen it done that way. So I'm going to create a span I'll just call it Mark 1. And since everything starts out contracted, I'm going to make Mark 1 be a plus. What is a span? A A span is simply a tag that you can put around content. And a span is an inline tag, so it's going to appear right alongside of the rest of the stuff here. Back in the old days, by old days I mean pre-HTML5, the span was sort of analogous to the div tag, where the div tag was the block version and the span tag was the inline version. So, I'm going to go and make a span 1, span 2, and span 3. Now, I'm going to do this the roundabout way, and then I'm going to do it a little bit, maybe a more clever way. All right, so now I have two things I want to change. I want to change the visibility of that submenu, and I also want to change the mark from a plus to a minus and a minus to a plus. So I'm going to include the mark as an argument. So we'll do mark 1, mark 2, and mark 3. I'm going to put CSS in here to get rid of the bullet points initially. UL list style type none. Actually, I might even be able to do this with the list style type. I don't know. But I'm going to do this using HTML because that's what I want to show. I now have two arguments, arg1 and arg2. One is going to be the submenu that I want to show. The other is going to be the span that I want to change to either a minus sign or a plus sign. So, I can say document get element by ID arg2, and arg2 is either going to be mark 1, mark 2, or mark 3. And if I hide it, I want to change mark 1, 2, or 3 to a plus sign. Now, this is pointing to this span. I have to say, what do I want to change about that span? And I want to change really the contents of that span tag, the stuff between the start and end tag. The name of the property for that is inner HTML. So I'm going to say inner HTML equals a plus. And then I'm going to go and change it to a minus. So if it's not displayed, I put a plus that indicates that it can be expanded. If it's displayed, I put a minus next to it showing that it can be contracted. So when I do this, I get this. The page loads, I click on that, it expands, and it shows a minus. I click on it again, and it goes back and shows a plus, indicating I can expand it. Alright, now, I can do a few different things with this. Alright, I could make it, I'm not going to do this, but I could make it so that I could only click on that little marker and not anywhere on the div, not the div, the menu. I would do that by simply changing this from being part of the LI to being part of the span. All right. In fact, what the heck, let's do it. So now, translate it. Now, I have to click on the plus sign and the minus sign. Because remember, these are links. If I click on them, I want to go to another page. One thing I just thought of is changing a pointer. I wonder how we change a pointer. I don't know. But I'll bet Google knows. This could be JavaScript or CSS, right? Because CSS is the appearance. JavaScript is the behavior. So I want to change the appearance when, I don't know. Change cursor. Can we do it in CSS? It looks like we can. Well, let's see. What cursor with the link is the pointer, right? Yeah. Let's make, what do we want the cursor, if they're on that, to do? Okay, alias, I'll scroll auto. Let's make it a crosshair. Okay, so I think I can do this. I think I can say span. I think. We'll find out. Alright, you could change the cursor to anything else that you want. But that's a pretty cool solution that mixes CSS and all that. Alright, so that's our first example of changing the HTML. And notice what we did, really. A lot of it is the same, right? In the sense that we point to the element on the page and then we say what we want to change about it. So we use the same document getElement by ID, but we're not changing anything about the style. We're changing the inner HTML property, which is, again, between the start and end tag. So whatever we want to put between the start and end tag, we could put on the other side of this equal sign. Now, if you're noticing this, not that it's that hard, but there's two arguments, all right? But really, the two arguments go together, right? We either want to do it to the first menu, the second menu, or the third menu. So we could give an argument of just 1, 2, or 3, right? So let's do that. I'm going to change this to say argument 1. I want to do that to the first submenu, the second submenu, the third submenu. And then I'm going to say, we're back to one argument again. What are the submenus called? They're called submenu 1, 2, and 3. What are the marks called? Mark 1, 2, or 3. Notice cleverly, they both end with a number. So it fits a pattern. So I can say, I want to find the element whose ID is submenu plus the argument. So it's going to concatenate the word submenu, which is enclosed in quotes, so that's a literal, with the value of the argument. And I can do that here and here. And then here, I can change it to say mark. Now, the nice thing about this is that this isn't going to be much harder if we added 10 submenus. We're just going to need to, on mouse over, show submenu 10, and so on. I do need quotation marks. No, I don't. Yes, I do. And it still works. And we're in business. Okay, yay. All right. Now, again, we had essentially 3 lectures to talk about JavaScript, so we don't have tons of time. But I do want to go over another classic in JavaScript. I put a link for validation. That's another classic in JavaScript. But another different classic in JavaScript is to do an image swap, to swap out images. All right? Now keep in mind there's a bunch of things that you could do to sort of simplify things and all that. And you could write more advanced code and all that. But this is just to get the basics down, to give you sort of a sense of what you can do in JavaScript and a sense of how you do it. So I have a couple of pages here that have some pictures. And let me see. I think I did this 2 ways, and I'm not really sure how it is, but we'll look at them. How's the other way? Oh, I used a function. One I did the straightforward sort of brute force way, and the other I wrote a function for. So, let's look at this one first, the simpler way. What I have is, if you put your mouse on the thumbnail, it changes the picture. Now, one thing I would say about this is, as far as thumbnails go, usually a thumbnail is considered just to be a smaller version of the picture, right? It doesn't have to be a smaller version of the picture. One thing that I like to do, and I didn't in this case, is to make all the thumbnails have the same proportion. We may have some pictures that are in portrait mode and some pictures that are in landscape mode. Let me draw this to show you what I mean. So we might have some pictures that look like this. And if we only made the thumbnails just a smaller version of the picture, we'd have some thumbnails that look like this, some thumbnails that look like this, and it would be a little bit sloppy. All right? Not really lined up too neatly. And then the big image would be over here. One thing you could do with a thumbnail is, there's no rule that says a thumbnail has to be a small copy of the image. You can actually crop the image and only take a portion of the image. Like, let's say my big image was a smiley face. All right? We could make, and then we had another image in landscape that was a frowny face. All right? If we were going to do that, this is what our thumbnails would look like, and it looks a little sloppy. We could instead take a perfect square crop of one of these images and a smaller version of that. So I could take and maybe make this square here the thumbnail. And I could keep the exact size of those thumbnails consistent, because regardless of whether they were portrait or landscape, I would make the thumbnail a square. And then maybe I take this as the thumbnail for the frowny face. Like that. I've actually seen some good, this done to good effect, like with artwork. All right? Instead of showing the entire painting, for example, in a thumbnail, take one portion of the painting and show it. If anything, that sort of creates a little bit of interest, like, gee, I wonder what that painting looks like completely, especially if they see a portion of it and they like the way it looks. That might motivate them to spend a minute to look at the painting, and so on. So when you're thinking of thumbnails, again, sort of the default most simple, basic way to do it is just to make shrunken versions of the images. But again, it's okay to crop the images and shrink them too, and only take a portion of the image to make your thumbnail. And you can do that through any photo editing tool pretty easily. Now, I didn't do that here, so I'm not practicing what I preach. All these thumbnails are simply smaller versions of the big picture. And I have it so that when I put my mouse over the image, the big image changes. So let's look at the first one. All right. Notice I have a section for my thumbnails. And my thumbnails are really just an unordered list of pictures, right? What are your thumbnails? They're a list of pictures. Now, what about those pictures? I made a copy of each picture, and I've called the thumbnail the name of the image with a T on the end. All right? And so I took my images. My images are 1, 2, and 3, the big images. And the smaller copies of them are 1, 2, 1T, 2T, and 3T. You actually could use CSS to resize the image if you wanted to. Make a thumbnail and give it a class of thumbnail and maybe make the width 50%. So you could do that. The problem with that is if you use CSS to make an image smaller, you're still downloading the full number of bytes for the image. And if you have a lot of images, that could make for a big web page. So you could kind of play it by ear. Some of these things that were really big deals back in the old days when there were slower internet connections are less of a big deal now. All right? But anyhow, I chose to make thumbnails for these. You could simply use the big picture and through CSS resize the images to be smaller. Okay, so I have 1, 1T, 2, 2T, 3, 3T. Over here, I have my thumbnails, and I didn't spend a lot of time with the alt attribute, but I have an alt attribute for each of them. And then I have a mouse over that says on mouse over, document get element by ID big.src, and then I set the src to a different value. And that's, again, a value. So it doesn't have .style.something. it has simply dot something. And again, notice what that attribute is that we're changing, the src. All right? It's not a coincidence that that matches the attribute on the image tag. That's the same attribute. We are setting the source of this image two different ways in this one web page. One way is we've given it sort of the initial value. When this page loads, the source is going to be image1.jpg. However, through JavaScript, we can change this image's source property by pointing to it and then setting the property to anything we want. So in this case, we have this, and as we move our mouse around, the actual image changes. Questions about that?
It says the ID is big. I couldn't spot it on the...
Yeah. The ID of big is this image down here. The full-size image that's in the middle of the page. And notice how I've used CSS to position things the way I wanted to. I made the thumbnails section have a width of 25%. I have made the images have a width of 100%, and I've gotten rid of the bullet points. The big picture, I made the width 60%, floated left, given it a margin, and I made the width of the big picture. Now, I could do this without thumbnails, as I mentioned. Let's go and do that. So, let me go and save this as zoo3.html. Now, if I do this without thumbnails, I just used a big picture for the thumbnail. All right? And the CSS will size it to the right size. Because the thumbnails has a width of 25%, and images within a thumbnail have a width of 100%, it's going to make it 100% of the 25%. All right? If that makes sense. So pretty much it's going to look the same. Now notice that when I do this, this one has a little bit different proportions, but it's okay because they're the same width. And this one's a little bit taller than the other images, but it doesn't really make it look sloppy. Does everyone get the difference I did between the two? This one would take slightly longer to load because it's loading all three big pictures first, and then it's swapping them. The other one would load slightly quicker because it's loading smaller images for all three and only loading one big image at a time. Now, that being said, once all three images get loaded, then there's no time at all to do the swap. It doesn't have to run out to the server and get the big image. It already has loaded the big image. Now, as I've mentioned last time, if you remember Pee-wee's Playhouse, anytime you see repeated code, that ought to be a sign to you that something's wrong. Now, we don't have to scream. All right, that was a metaphor. That wasn't literally to scream. All right, but we have essentially the same block of code over and over and over again. And what's typically good with this would be to give a function. All right? And that's what we do in this example. I've created a change image function. I've actually done better with this because not only do I change the image, I change the all attribute. So and I change it to be an on click instead of on mouse over. I'm not sure that's really a good idea, but I did want to show that you could trigger this occurring from a click or a mouse over. So the way this one works now is doesn't do anything when we mouse over it, but when we click on it, it changes it. So when we click on any of the images, it invokes the change image function. And it passes two values, two arguments. The first one is the name of the image that we want to change. What we want to change the big image to, the name of the image file. And the second argument is what we want to set the alt attribute to. So if we put our mouse over the first thumbnail, we want the big image to become 1.jpg, and we want the alt attribute to say picture of lion. The second one, we change it to 2JPEG, picture of lion. I could have come up with a different way to word it. Picture 3, however, is a picture of an orangutan. Now, how does that function work? So we click that. We've grouped all the statements that are repeated with the name, change image. We've put that in a script function. We've given it two arguments, image src and image alt, and we set the source to the first argument, the alt to the second argument. Again, though, same idea as when we used the style property. We use document get element by ID to point to something on the page, then we describe what it is we want to change. So we change it to .src. We want to change the .src property of the thing on the page that has an ID of big. Then in the second line, we want to change the alt property. These are two sort of fundamental things that JavaScript is used for. The ones that we covered thoroughly are the menu, the mouse over menu, and expanding submenus, and the other one being image swaps. Another big one, again, I posted a reference to, that is validation. Any questions about any of this? Yes?
Does it matter where you put the script on your page? Because I feel like anything I see online says to put it by the footer, but then when you look at page sources, they're kind of all over the place.
If you coded it right, well, here's the way I would do it, and there's a little catch to it. There's a catch to it. Let me write a little demo program. All right, and I'll show you why. The quick answer to your question is it can matter.
Right.
The better answer to your question is put it in the head and write your code so that it doesn't matter that it's in the head. Okay, so let's write a quick example. I'm going to save this as bad because this is the way some people would write their code, and it's bad. All right? So I'm going to get rid of all this. I don't even know what I'd call this, bad example of this. I'm going to go in and I'm going to create a paragraph with an ID ID of current date. All right. I can put JavaScript code that's not in a function, just smack dab in the middle of my page. If I do that, it's going to run it as the browser loads the page, literally from sequence, from top to bottom. So I'm going to write this, and it's going to work for now, all right? But then we'll break it. So let me refresh my memory. JavaScript date. All right, date now. I'm going to say document get element by ID current date dot inner HTML equals date dot now. Okay, looks good. This should work. And it doesn't.
So you have to use
Date now is not a function. Oh. There we go. That's the date. That's the date in milliseconds since, I believe, something like January 1st, 1900. But don't quote me on that. Let's see if we can find a way to convert that into a legible date. A is the time of milliseconds. Okay, number of milliseconds elapsed since January 1st, 1970. Okay. It's a dense way to store the data. In very few bytes, you can store a lot of. You can be very precise and not take up a lot of space. So, let's put this in then. So that,
You have to fix your A.
pardon me?
You have to fix your A after the inner HTML.
Was that what you were pointing out? Okay. All right, so. All right, there we go. Yay. So that's our current date. By the way, if this was on a web server, here's a good question for you. If this is on a web server in Iceland, would it show now or would it show almost 6 p.m.? If this code was on a web server in Iceland and we were accessing it here at LC.
Depends on the function that you.
Pardon me?
It depends on the function that you use for the date.
Yeah, kind of. But what I'm getting at is, remember, this is code that's run on the client. So this is going to show my date and time, not the web server's date and time. Okay, so we got this and it works. All right. So, this will work because paragraph with ID of current date has already been created. Right? This is below that paragraph. So this paragraph exists by the time this code runs around. Now, if I go and let me comment all this out. If I go and copy this and put this before this, all right, this will not work. Has not been defined, right? As the browser is loading this page, it's executing this JavaScript. When it hits this line, it hasn't seen that there's such a paragraph called current date. So this is going to blow up. All right. Why did it blow up? We look at the console. And it'll tell me, current date's null. I don't know what current date is, so you can't set the null of the inner property. So that's why position matters. All right. But now we're going to do the good way. All right. We're going to do the good way. All right. And that will be to write it so that we can put it where it belongs in the head. Because it's kind of a mess if JavaScript is strewn throughout the page, in my opinion. I want all my JavaScript in the head section. But I have to make sure that the page is loaded before I try to execute it. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my script up here. I'm going to wrap it in a function. And remember when we put code in a function, putting a code in a function doesn't say that you're executing it. You're defining that function so that you can call it later on, right? So I'm going to go and I define my function to display the date. I'm going to put on the body tag onLoad equals display date. I'll get rid of this JavaScript. Now this is going to work even though the code is above it, because I've defined that function above it. The page loads. I don't execute it until the page has been completely loaded. When the page is loaded, then I'm going to execute display date. And at this point, the paragraph has been created. And it displays. So, you were probably expecting a yes or no answer, right? And instead you got 20 minutes worth.
I was expecting that type of answer, I guess.
Yeah.
It's always the answer.
Yeah, that usually is always the answer, right? That's the kind of thing. But again, in my mind, the last way I did it, the way I called good, is the best practice. Put all your JavaScript in the head and make sure nothing executes until the page loads.
So, okay, so when they're saying to put it in the footer, that's because they're not creating functions, they're just throwing it all at the bottom?
It could be one of two things. They might not be creating functions, or they don't completely understand what's going on, and they know if they put it on in the footer that everything's already loaded, so they're good to go.
Okay.
So that would be my guess. I guess we're out of time. All right, so we'll wrap up here. There's obviously a lot more we can talk about. This is just an introduction to JavaScript. Remember, we will meet, assuming the lab is open, we will meet right away in the lab at 11 on Wednesday. If the lab's not open, we'll come here.
Wednesday or Thursday?
Thursday. The other Wednesday, the second Wednesday this week, Thursday. All right. Okay, I will go unlock the lab, come back here, grab my files, and I'll be back in there. If anyone comes looking for me, no, I was going to say, I should clarify that. If a student comes looking for me, tell them I'll be right back, because I had a couple people indicating that they might come to lab today. If it's a law enforcement official, tell them that I'm not here. All right. Just kidding.